I wonder, who will he become? What will be the story of his life? His is yet to be written, but mine is like a book that never ends. Yet I am a part of him, building him cell by cell, right here, right now. I am invisible to you, but if you look closer, you'll find me. See? You call me an atom, an element, the fundamental building block of life. You name me carbon. But would you believe me if I said that before I arrived here, I was here? I was caught by the wind, flung down and buried under the earth. I was breathed in by a falcon and expelled. I was burned in the belly of a machine. That's me, again, right there, coming out of the tailpipe. True story. This perfectly formed child is partly built of pollution, of waste. You think you know me, but do you?
Levels of carbon pollution in our atmosphere have increased dramatically.
Daily choice is to reduce their carbon footprint.
We'll abolish the carbon tax.
Global carbon emissions are tipped to hit a record high this
Start
year.
of yet another war over carbon.
People saying we have a carbon problem. What is your carbon footprint? What is your carbon tax? And I'm thinking, don't blame carbon. Carbon. It's not carbon's fault.
Carbon is profoundly important in the universe. She is what makes us possible.
We are nature because we are made of carbon. So is everything else.
Every one of us lives in a carbon world. We have to learn to get along with carbon.
Nothing is more urgent to the survival of human civilization as we know it than understanding carbon and where she likes to hide.
I am the most talked about, but least understood element on Earth. If you are to survive me, you must understand me.
Thank you.
Hello, and welcome. Thanks very much for joining us tonight at these beautiful studios at Revolution Recording. If you're joining us by live stream, you're missing out on a very exciting weather event here in Toronto. And for all of you who showed up in person, thanks so much for being here with us tonight. We are here to take a very intimate look at some remarkable music for a very remarkable film. This is the score to Carbon, the Unauthorized Biography, which, by the way, just got a CSA nomination for the Rob Stewart Award for Science and Nature. So congrats to the whole team on that. My name is Adrian Ellis. I'm a film and TV composer, and I'm also the chair of the Screen Composers Guild of Canada. So I'd just like to do a quick land acknowledgement here for us all tonight. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of the many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'd also like to give some thanks to CBC and the Canada Council for the Arts, who have been very gracious in helping us fund this incredible evening. I'm joined by two creative powerhouses next to me here. I've got Niobe Thompson, the director of this film, and next to him, Jonathan Kawchuk, the wonderful composer. Tonight we have an incredible honor, a pleasure, a real treat to be joined by a huge complement of wonderful orchestral musicians as well as a choir who are going to be performing some of the cues from this wonderful score. And then we're going to be looking, sort of taking a deep dive into how the score was created, how this film was made, in fact, and how these two complementary visual and sonic elements inform and help each other tell a very important story. So what you just heard was 1MO1 opening, very aptly named, which is the first cue of the documentary. So I'd love to start, Niobe, if I could, with the genesis of the film. How did you come to this being something that you obviously would have had to spend many years thinking about, working on, finding the funds to make, and then just sort of living inside? What was the genesis of this whole project?
Well, if we go all the way back to the beginning, the genesis of this project was Primo Levi's autobiography, and the last chapter of that autobiography is dedicated to the element carbon. But it's my friend Daniela Ortega in Australia, who's my co-director, who was inspired to tell the story of this incredible element carbon from the first person, to really go on carbon's own journey through the universe, through our bodies, through outer space and deep below the Earth's mantle, to really unpack what is the most consequential element in our universe. That's carbon. And so Daniela is an old friend of mine, and we joined forces about a year before we started making this film. And this is a Canadian-Australian co-production. So I know that our Australian friends are joining us on the other side of the world. Hello and good morning to all of you. But good day, good day. Oh, that's just an abomination. So yeah, it really was the joining of two creative teams in Canada and Australia around this very ambitious project, this very ambitious concept, and that led us all over the world to locations from Mongolia to Tasmania to Canada's west coast. And then eventually, if you play the tape forward, to the challenge of making a very complicated musical score.
And I mean, this is not the first time that you've done something like this. So if we're rewinding the tape forward to that moment, of course, there's a lot of other elements within this film that are ambitious. I mean, the visual design of it and the animations are just absolutely gorgeous. There's nothing that looks like it was rushed. There's nothing in this that looks like it was done halfway. You're going full commitment, full bore on all these things. On the musical side of things, that's something that you've done before. Our good friend Darren Fung has been your composer on some past projects, and you've taken that to a high level. Why go that route? I mean, the more complexity you add to something, the more you can sort of see things possibly going wrong. But obviously, you have a full commitment to this, and you see great value in it. Can you sort of speak to what that is in the music and how you go about it?
Well, of course, I think our audience can detect that this score involved many live players, a small orchestra and choir and soloists. And so, I should acknowledge that this is every film director's dream, to have tools like this, and then to work with a composer who can handle tools like this and make them work. Multiply that by 100 when you're talking about documentary. It right. Really is a rare honor to be able to work at this level. But we had a really very ambitious story to tell. The amplitude of emotion and ideas in a story about carbon, which is literally everywhere, demanded a score with real range. And I've worked with Jonathan for a few years, never anywhere close to this level of ambition. As you mentioned, we worked with Darren Fung, the Canadian composer, with orchestras, and he was great. But with this one, I approached Jonathan and sort of proposed that he work with a set of tools that he hadn't had on a project of ours before, because we needed that range. We needed to unpack carbon in all her moods. And I was convinced from the beginning that this would require as many tools as possible, creative range, but also the ability to go big with an orchestra.
Sounds like a tall order. Jonathan, when Niobe came to you with this, maybe you can also speak a bit about how you first started working with him, but what was that like for you? What was your first reaction to hearing, oh, here's the story we're going to tell, here's how we want to approach it, and here's what you are being asked to do?
Oh, wow. I cannot remember. I mean, this was born of the pandemic, and it went in and out of being a reality, and then there were a couple recording dates where it couldn't happen, and we found a window, and so it sort of oscillated between being very real and very immediate and happening, and also hard to imagine for me at the beginning. My process is really sound designy. Normally, I look for different ingredients I can use that come from the world of the film, sort of this like locally sourced approach. And I bought, I mean, you may have heard some off the top of this cue, which we can maybe play. I bought this Japanese charcoal thing called binchatan, which I'm butchering the name, but it rings like a xylophone, and you can buy it at cooking stores. And this is the beginning of my process with carbon, and then it got more and more and more and more orchestral. And it took a while to figure out the nature of the beast, for sure, I think. Yeah.
Did you work conceptually? Is that how you typically work? Like you say, it's sort of this locally sourced, you said. So you're taking things directly out of perhaps the wild sound of a film, or you're looking at like, what's this film about, and finding sounds in nature. Or was there a conceptual approach that you took with this to start?
Yeah, definitely. For me, that's usually how I work with films, is trying to find within the world of the film what sounds can be reconstituted into a score.
Yeah.
Which makes it feel like it walks through that fourth wall a little bit more to me. And part of the challenge was with Carbon was, do that, but then also there's this more traditional element of the orchestra, and that isn't supposed to do that. That's supposed to be well and fully outside the world of the film. So how to make them talk together in a way that seems amicable at best, that was a challenge, to figure out how to marry those worlds. And as whoever's listening out there may have heard, it's not just orchestra. There's synthetic elements, there's sound design elements. It's kind of a lot going on.
Well, there's two parts to this. There's the challenge, which we'll get into, but there's also this idea of these sounds. There's a couple of interesting ones in this opening. Did you want to talk about those and maybe play some of those back for the audience so that they get a sense of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I would love. First of all, we're here at beautiful Revolution recording in Toronto, and unlike a live performance, we're in the studio here, and we're able to dive into cues like we wouldn't be able to do maybe in a more live context. So I just thought I'd say that explicitly. Like, it's pretty fun. We get to wind things back. We get to call out bar numbers. So we're working with Dennis, and I can say, Dennis, can you please wind it back to the very beginning? And we'll, without orchestra, we'll play some of the pre-recorded elements. So I spent all day one day going to different knife stores that carried this charcoal just for that little twinkling. So I hope that was worth it, because that was like an all-day project, that 40 milliseconds of twinkling. Another,
Jonathan, I have to admit that I knew you were dicking around with Carbon, but I only found out that that's where that sound was in the film this evening.
I'm incredibly efficient as a composer.
I think it's worth saying for people who maybe are a little bit outside this process that the composer has to wait until the picture is locked to really start their process, right? But Jonathan was so committed and excited about this film that he was developing sounds months before we locked picture. One day in the middle of the winter, I called him, and he was in a cabin near Canmore. And you've been dropping microphones through the ice of the lakes above Canmore, above in the reservoir, and recording sounds, right? And you're really excited about this, and I just kind of thought, oh man, like how does this relate to the score that we're going to have in the end? But to your credit, with all of that, swinging your arms in the dark for a few months before we got to Lock Picture. You came, when we finally came to the spotting sessions, you had so many themes and sounds and tools like that ready to go.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad you felt that way. I'm glad you felt that.
I did.
So much of scoring a film is swinging your arms in the dark, because you just don't know what the grammar of the film is going to be for so long. Even when it's locked, it doesn't really reveal itself. So it's best to have a few different directions you could go. I mean, there are a lot of things that I threw out that didn't make it onto Carbon.
So this
yeah.
is an interesting point. I mean, we're seeing now director and composer kind of joking back and forth in retrospect, or, like looking back, it's easy to look. But there's this real, I think for anyone who's listening or anyone who's here who is a filmmaker, on that side, as a director, as a producer, anyone who's looking at a composer doing something, you have to have a certain amount of trust that it's going to work out in the end. Mm-hmm. And some of these processes take time, and they're indistinct, and they're sort of, a bit in the dark. And on the other side, a composer has to furnish a certain amount of space for themselves, and then to be able to say, I'm going to commit myself to doing these things, even though I don't know what the answer is going to be. So, John, how do you not panic when you're in that mode? Like, how do you give yourself that space? How do you sort of produce a region in time for yourself to go, no, I'm going to be doing this, and it's going to be worth it?
There's an assumption in that I don't panic. How do I not panic? I do sometimes.
I panic.
You panic? You're not supposed to tell me that. You can't say that. Yeah, geez. I think Niobe and I have been working together since the beginning of my career. I've done enough film composition now that I know that there's a way to sort of brute force yourself into the answers of this. And it always comes. It's not a great answer, but it is true. Every time I've panicked in the past, it's been for naught. The answer is to just keep writing, and it won't be that long until something clicks. I don't know. How do I not panic? I mean, I do. It really can be. It's an up and down emotional. It's an emotional job in a lot of ways.
So then I guess for Niobe, on your side, for all the directors and people out there who are the managing side of this creative process, which may be completely like looking at someone trying to learn a foreign language, how do you set up a situation where you feel like this is going to be fine, and you're not going, oh, maybe we need to do something different, and curtail a process that may just need to play out?
Well, I mean, directors need to be educated to work with their composers. They need to learn from, I think, good composers how to find a common language and then to develop trust in the right ways. And so, I mean, I do credit Darren Fung for dealing with me in a much less mature phase of my directing career. But what I learned first of all is that there's when you want to work with live recorded sessions, there's time pressure to approve cues and prepare, arrange and orchestrate for a set recording window. And that window can't move because you have an entire orchestra and choir, as we see tonight, waiting for you. So you need to learn to trust your composer, and I would say less experienced directors often want really polished draft cues or MIDI cues before they can approve them. They want to hear what the music's actually going to sound like. What I've learned is that's a waste of time. You have to have trust, and so I think this. I know what cue you want to play next, Adrian, and I think this is a great example of this. I mean, let's show our audience how awful a draft cue sounds compared to the final version of it. And what I want to say before we go there is that because I've got this relationship with Jonathan, I knew it'd be wonderful. I wouldn't have been in that place 10 years earlier.
So this is going to be 3MO8, Carbon Rising. And just so everyone knows, just because of some sync, interesting sync things that Google and YouTube might do to us, we're going to be selectively stripping out voiceover and dialogue. So if you don't hear it at certain points, we're only going to be playing it where it's really necessary and sometimes stripping it out.
Do we want to play the bad one first, or
we're just going to play? Yeah, right now we'll just play the mock-up only. So orchestra, please hold your beauty back.
Yeah. Put your seatbelts on.
This is version 1. Here we go. Yeah, that's probably more than enough of that.
Yep.
That's well and good. Thank you, Dennis. Okay, let's do it with orchestra as soon as possible so we can get that out of our ears.
Okay, video's good.
Again.
Did you guys do that on purpose? We lost our click. I lost the click. I don't know. Did you guys just click? Huh? You did it on purpose, didn't you?
Again.
One,
How do scientists measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? They take a glass sphere, they evacuate all the air from it, so it's a vacuum inside, and then you take it to a remote part of the atmosphere and you open it up and all the air rushes inside, and then you take that glass sphere back to your lab and you hook it up to a machine that can distinguish between all of the different gases in that sample. That's how scientists have been regularly monitoring the contents of the atmosphere over time. And that's how we know that carbon dioxide is building up.
Wonderful. So what does that look like, Niobe, for you and Jonathan? I guess the question might be for Jonathan, like when you present something like this, what kind of language can you use, or what do you do to put your director in the right frame of mind when they hear something like that MIDI mock-up initially? Because I mean, to me, when I hear that, I hear the intent. Mm-hmm. I know where you're going to go with it. I mean, there are certain questions that I have if I hear that, but I think a director has an entirely different set of questions that are, you know, they can't, I mean, what's the toolkit, right? So where do you start?
Well, I think, first of all, we can all agree it's not a good MIDI mock-up. It could have been better. But working with Niobe, it's not just the composer who has a skill set with working with an orchestra. It's the producer, it's the director. It's, you know, it's not just us who have to learn this skill if it's going to happen. And I know that Niobe has a great imagination musically, and I need to spend less time with him when it comes to making a good MIDI mock-up. I myself am bad with that, though. Whenever I work with a graphic designer or something, I have a bad imagination for the way that things could be. So yeah, all credit to him that way. And there's a lot of like there's a lot of prefacing when you send in a V1 like that, trying to ease the tension. But yeah, there's a shorthand that I think we have where I have to do less to get to a point where we're both comfortable than I would the first time we worked together, for example.
I'll jump in there. I think there is a lot of uncertainty in the process when you're working in this way, when you're not hearing the finished version because your music's not coming out of the box, when you're only going to hear your final music after you've recorded it with real musicians and edited it. And so you have to be committed to that process. And I think that there's sort of maybe a risk aversion that's involved in asking for in the box scores, synthetic scores without live players. I really love the process of working with live recorded scores. I love the surprising nature of it, but I'll go back to that moment I can recall when I sort of learned to trust composers. It was, again, working with Darren Fung. We were recording a score with the Evanston Symphony Orchestra, and it was for a 3-part series called The Great Human Odyssey. And, we had spent 3 months working with MIDI and approving cues, and I just felt like I was kind of going along with it because what I was hearing in the MIDI was it just sounded awful, and this anxiety just rose and rose in me. I was fit to burst. I thought, we're gonna have a terrible score, and we're gonna fall on our faces in front of all of Canada and the world. And I remember being in the Windspear that morning when we started the first sessions and standing at the edge of the stage, and the ESO started, and it all washed away. Like, it was such a transformational moment. And I think I promised myself at that point, okay, I'm going to do everything I can in my career as a filmmaker to get back to this moment again and again, right? But I was just like, shout out to all those directors and producers. Have the trust; it's worth it in the end.
I'm curious, just as a quick sidebar, we do have a little bit of a live audience here who's being very cool about the fact that we're behind them and they can't see us, and this is like a live podcast kind of thing. And I'm curious, I've asked this in the chat, but who here is a composer? Do you want to raise your hand in the audience? Yes. Okay, excellent. Do we have any directors here? Producers? Editors? Other?
We got a good mix.
There's at least one person who didn't raise their hand, and I have questions.
Prefer not to say.
Undisclosed.
Undisclosed.
Okay, that's all. That was my crowd participation moment.
Yeah. Speaking of shout-outs, we should give Red Janes a shout-out for her final vocal performance that's on the playback there. Wish she could be here and to do that live again, because it's quite a remarkable, I would say, acrobatic feat done with her vocal chops there, which is pretty amazing. So Niobe, you're talking about this idea of needing to have a certain amount of imagination when you're going from the samples and a kind of like mocked up computer-based realization of something that's going to be performed by live people. On the other side of the coin is the oft repeated phrase that composers know well or should know, that samples lie. And sometimes you do things in a mock-up that sound great in a mock-up and are either unplayable by musicians or will just not work the way you think they will work. And I think this was one case where there was some things that didn't quite go the way that you'd anticipated with, and I think it has to do with the pits in this case. Is that?
Yeah. There's part of the art of learning to work with an orchestra in a film score versus a live context, or what maybe we would imagine working with an orchestra is like, is that it's a studio craft thing. And there's a whole host of considerations you have to have when you're thinking about how you structure the order in which you record the cues. And one thing, an example in this was the pizzicato, which for audiences is like, oh, can somebody give us pits? Anyone? Yeah. Plunk. Like you pluck it with your finger. Versus arco, which is using a bow. When we were in the recording studio, it came in Vancouver at the warehouse, it became very obvious that the most bang for our buck was going to be this beautiful, lush, bowed arco sound. And for whatever reason, in that room, the recording quality, the fake pizzicato that we were using was just working way better, and we had to make a game time decision. Okay, let's think about this in terms of the end product, which doesn't really care whether you did it live or if you use samples. It cares whether it's good. And the better thing was to do the arco live, and the better thing was to do the pits using samples. And there's such a brutal pragmatism when it comes to film scoring that is actually very liberating. I like it. And that's a good example of just like, okay, time to switch it up in a way that would make some of my professors cringe or whoever, and do the thing that works well for the film. Because you are, whether you'd like to admit it or not, a filmmaker first and a composer second, and it has to serve the film. And so you make all kinds of studio decisions.
Question for either of you, and this I think this gets to the crux of making films or making anything really that has a vision behind it, right? You set out to make something that you want to exceed a certain expectation. You don't want it to be ordinary. You won't have ambitions. Mixed in with that, of course, is the reality, the harsh pragmatism that you're talking about of going, okay, you know what, we've come to this apex now, we have to make a decision. Do we try and continue and go down this path, or do we call it and say, you know what, we're going to just have to work with this as it is or use this other means to get to where we're going? How does that decision-making process look for you, especially when you're under the extraordinary pressures of a live recording session, which is very expensive in some cases?
Well, when you ask that question, Adrian, I think of what it was like to make this documentary in the middle of a pandemic. You know, this was approved and commissioned just as the pandemic started, and so, you know, I feel like there were, I'm not going to call them compromises, but we had to really, you know, duck and weave all through the pandemic. We had a production team in Australia, a production team in Canada, and as we shut down in Canada, they were open in Australia, and vice versa. You know, it really was our ambition to make a global film about a universal subject that didn't look like it was made in a pandemic. You won't see a single mask in this film. So you know, I think the harsh reality of the pandemic was the pragmatic filter we dealt with the whole time. But when it came to the music, this just doesn't ring true for me. I mean, I feel like the score really exceeded all of our hopes. It's a beautiful score, and you know, it took a real fight. It takes a real fight every time we deal with commissioning editors to preserve the resources to approach a score this way. You know, and I think that if anyone was making sacrifices, it was my friend Jonathan here in a tent in Nelson, doing the composition work all through the summer before we recorded. But my
roommate got COVID, just for context. I do live in not a tent, but there was a good 2 weeks before the recording session. I lived in a tent on my porch, composing this, and it was very forest fiery at the time, and. Yeah, that's a good war story.
This deserves a segue. I think this is segue one. Yeah. Because, you know, as always in this industry, we're working with each other by Zoom, right? We're seeing each other on screen, and so every day I would tune in, and there would be Jonathan in his little room, and his hair, like you can see, he's got long hair, right? Well, his hair would just get crazier and crazier, and I knew he was under a lot of pressure, so I didn't want to bring it up. But, you know, finally it emerged that someone had COVID in the house. We were under time pressure. We had to, you know, get a certain amount of music composed every day, and so you couldn't get COVID. A whole project was hanging on you, and so you weren't even going in your place to have showers, right?
No, I was showering in the studio.
Yeah. Oh, you were showering.
Well apparently not very well.
How does one shower in a studio?
Okay, so this is how comfortable Jonathan feels around me, obviously. But I mean, he was showering but not combing his hair. That's what it was.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, what were we talking about? Making compromises? So I feel like he made all the compromises.
It's very necessary.
But it was not reflected in the beautiful music.
That's wonderful. I mean, you know, there's as they say, you never finish mixing, you just stop, or you never finish a film, you just stop editing or whatever. So I think that's really what I'm speaking about most. Of course, the results speak for themselves. They're wonderful. It's just that, again, sometimes you have to make those decisions. Like, you know what? It would be lovely to get this recorded for real, but it's not working for whatever reason. It's no one's fault. It's just sometimes the circumstances, and you have to move on. But you've teed us up beautifully for, I think, our next cue here, which is, I think, as you're talking about writing on a porch, in a tent, without a comb, in a forest fire. So 4MO4, if we could get everyone ready for that. Is there anything else you want to say about this cue before we run it, John? Or Niobe?
Can I say 30 seconds of stuff?
Please.
Yeah. So this cue you're about to see is really shaped intellectually around the anguish of a climate scientist. And so, you'll see here on the screen in a moment, it's Joelle Gerges from Australia. And so Jonathan's job was to really reflect that inner crisis that she was experiencing, seeing the data every day, and also being the mother of kids. And so, really a difficult challenge for Jonathan to face as a composer.
Frost, it shows or indicates we're approaching a tipping point. And when we hit that tipping point, the Earth can flip into a state we call hothouse Earth. It's going to lead to tens of meters of sea level rise, coastal flooding, enormous dry areas, droughts, and so on. And when rain comes, it'll be much more intense and violent. Storms will be much more violent. Many parts of the Earth will become uninhabitable for humans. Carbon has gone from being a benevolent force, a protector of the Earth system in a stable state. But now, as she's being released and increasing in the atmosphere, she's becoming a destroyer of ecosystems, damaging human health, and so on, in a very short period of time.
This is part of this new normal. This is actually a scientist's worst nightmare. The very thing that we've been trying to talk to people about is actually unfolding right now. And so I think we need to come to terms with these irreversible losses. And I think that's something that I started to come to terms with, realising that we are part of this generation that are witnessing the destruction of the Earth. Precious is slipping through your fingers, and that's all there is, and it's going to go. And I think it's one of those things that when you feel that if you call for help, that someone will respond. And I think there are moments where I feel like abandoned in that space, and it feels like the
Wow, that's a very powerful cue and a very powerful moment in the film, of course. What do you want to say about that, either of you? I mean, that's a huge piece, and I think I mean we really have to sort of give a big applause to the orchestra for getting through that cue so beautifully as well, and just really representing the power of that whole thing. It's that's not an easy feat. You hear them really working hard to realize that. John, anything to say about that at this point?
Yeah, well, I mean, musically, which maybe we'll talk about. Thank you. I can't believe the director is instructing me I should know how to use one of these. Musically, yeah, it is a big piece, and this is part of that studio craft thing. You don't have to think about orchestration the same way that you would if it was live. So for this cue, we want it to be really big. We basically pretended we had 2 orchestras and orchestrated it twice and did it twice to make it feel really, really big. And you can layer things on top of each other like that if you so choose, or if you just don't have the player count, you can what's called multi-track it for those at home. And this is kind of another way you can get around some of the budget constraints that might occur to you working with a big orchestra. We thought it would be cool to mock that up, where we're going to add some of what we just recorded, or rather some of what we recorded in Vancouver, and play a little bit of that cue again with that full orchestra under it to show you what it's like to have kind of 2 orchestras playing at once in terms of thickness. And it makes sense. We can go from 2 before 1835, maybe? Yeah? Oh, sorry, that was a John mistake there. We'll just go from the top of yeah, that last one. Thanks.
Live orchestra or playback from the floor?
Sorry?
Do you want them playing on the floor now?
Oh yes, everyone playing, and we'll bring up those orchestra stems for them to play on top of.
Frost, it shows or indicates we're approaching a tipping point. And when we hit that tipping point, the Earth can flip into a state we call hothouse Earth. It's going to lead to tens of meters of sea level rise, coastal flooding, enormous dry areas, droughts, and so on. And when rain comes, it'll be much more intense and violent. Storms will be much more violent. Many parts of the Earth will become uninhabitable for humans. Carbon has gone from being a benevolent force, a protector of the Earth system in a stable state. But now, as she's being released and increasing in the atmosphere, she's becoming a destroyer of ecosystems, damaging human health, and so on, in a very short period of time.
Thanks, Steve. So yeah, a little bit thicker, a little bit bigger.
Now, we talked with Claudio a little bit about showing off a little bit what the orchestra gets into, some of the acrobatics here and the fun stuff of this particular cue. Claudio, you remember where we wanted to take it from? And we can just do it in the air?
1380.
And this is without playback.
Yeah. So when you're watching it to the picture, of course, you notice that the fire starts raging and the orchestra starts really sawing away, which is pretty exciting. Ready?
Amazing. Thanks, team. Yeah, I like what, yeah, capturing that, the fire in that was difficult. Well, kind of difficult. We wanted to talk a little bit about the context in which this cue was written, which I was in a forest fire when I wrote this cue in Nelson, BC. I think at a time it was the worst air quality in the world for a bit. And yeah, it just would like blow my nose and there'd be blood every day. It was horrible. And that one of the most brutal it was all summer. And one of the worst times just so happened to be when I was supposed to compose this cue. So in some ways it was kind of easy as to have an emotional reference to figure out what to write because we were in it. Yeah. So another war story.
This is of course another question of sort of the technical aspect of it, because of course you have this emotional reaction. You're both, responding to the film itself. You're responding to your director's vision and what they're sort of looking for, and then again you're having this sort of oddly appropriate sort of environmental input that's adding to what you're sort of experiencing. Then you have to put it in front of an orchestra who has to sight read this on the spot in a very compressed amount of time. Was there, like, what did that look like on the day? Was there ever a moment where you thought this might be challenging, or
This is probably at least in my opinion, I think this is probably the most challenging cue of the film to sight read. I'm just like going through the other cues in my mind. This is the one we were most worried about. It was definitely really ambitious to try to get all. But it's also unfriendly in terms of time signatures for musicians out in the live stream.
But it has a very destabilizing feeling. Like you feel like, whoa, you're thrown off, and I think that's the intent, obviously, that but they have to really pay attention to what they're reading there.
Well, and all credit to our orchestrators. So part of the process when you work with an orchestra this big is usually on a film, a person just does not have the time to do all jobs. So even though I'm writing it, I'm not putting pen to paper in terms of writing what the actual notes the orchestra is playing. I take sort of the synthetic versions that I make and the MIDI programming that I do, which is, I don't think we can explain MIDI, but sort of, I take an electronic version of that, and then it's somebody else's job to find the best way for the orchestra to recreate that, because you're working in parallel with so many different people, just in the same way that the sound design has to happen at the same time as music. It can't happen after. There's so many things within the music department, which as a composer, you're the head of department more than you are the creative. You're the head of department first. So so much of the credit for how playable these things can be when they are difficult goes to the orchestrators, in this case, Lenny and Claudio.
I think this is a good spot to maybe talk a little bit about the money side of things, because we sort of alluded to the departments, the people that you have to trust and lean on, including, Hal Beckett, your wonderful conductor, and all the people that are at the studios and people like Dennis here. Because I know that it was very important for you to talk about this idea that we don't want to make this seem like something that only an elite few can, that something like this is within the reach of anyone who wants to do it, given a few factors. So, Niobe, can you sort of walk us through sort of your thinking, your approach to this, your perspective on how to get this done?
Well, I mean, first of all, this is expensive. We're making a film for public broadcasters, in this case in Australia, Canada, and France, and so we work under agreements with the guilds and the unions, and so we're committed to doing this in our own home countries and not taking off for Prague and doing this much more cheaply. But when I realized that those were the rules, I sort of said to myself, we can make a virtue of that. We can really celebrate live play in our own country, and that's been a principle for most of my career for me. So of course it takes years and usually many disappointments to get to a place where you can afford to work at this level. This was a feature documentary with a budget of over $2 million when we put the various funding sources together from all the different countries who participated. So really a very generous budget for documentary, I won't lie. But it still takes a real commitment to preserve, to protect the resources within that budget for practically the very last thing you do, which is to make the music, right?
Right.
And it's very common in film for producers and directors to make decisions that mean that by the time you get to the music creation, there's just nothing left in the tank, right? And so I guess I've learned how to manage a budget as a producer over the years so that that money is there. Because you're tempted to think of film as a visual medium. It's not a visual medium. It's a visual and oral medium. And emotionally and intellectually, the sounds are working at your brain to the same extent that the images are. I really believe that. And so, it's my job to work really hard to write the film and to film the film and to create those images and to work with an editor to bring them together. But none of that works without sound and music, right? So yeah, this is expensive. It's an expensive approach. It's probably not available to most filmmakers unless they really set out to work at this budget level. But you also have to be committed to taking whatever money you have and putting a good chunk of it toward the music. And that's a personal belief of mine.
John, anything to add to that? I mean, I have my own thoughts about different ways that you can approach these kinds of things.
Yeah, I would love to hear them. I mean, this is not my everyday. This is not most films that I work on. But most films that I work on wish to have sort of the same emotional engagement. And for me, that really, as somebody who grew up playing synthesizers and stuff, it's still really the case that live performance really adds so much. I don't think I've done a film in a long time where there isn't somebody playing live on it. And so I don't know. For me, at least, the higher the budget, the more people are involved when it comes to live players. You start getting into the situation where you write the music first, and then it's sort of formalized by the process of having an orchestra come in. Whereas maybe the more DIY it is, that process flips, and I start working with performers before writing to generate ideas together, and that I think gets us a little bit more mileage. So that's sort of my throttle is the less people can be involved because of the budget, the earlier they have to come in. The higher the budget, the more people are involved, the more traditional the workflow has to be, if that is helpful.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about this, Adrian?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing I'd like to add for anyone who is, on the side of producing the film, directing, anyone who has the decision-making powers on that, is that it doesn't always have to be the case that you need to fill every single second of your film with music, first of all, or that each one of those seconds has to be entirely recorded. You can, say, select those cues that you feel are the most important cues, or even make selections with the help of your composer about what cues will get recorded and what cues, this is just a long sustained note for 30 seconds. This doesn't need to be done by an orchestra. Or you take, your set of themes and you record 20 minutes of music, and then you have a set of materials that you can use to, spot throughout your film and maintain an incredibly high quality whilst not spending, an enormous amount of budget that you may not have. So I think there's just many ways to sort of approach that problem and go, as long as we're focused on the vision of doing this and making something that is of high quality, there are many different ways to work with a composer and figure out that budget and come up with a really wonderful product at the end.
There are many cues on Carbon that do not have full orchestra. And our recording order, there was a little bit of like, okay, let's not do the hardest cue first thing in the morning. Like we did a bit of that, but it did more or less go in order of absolutely has to have orchestra to would be nice. And we got to a lot of the would be nice stuff, but there's a lot of cues that don't have orchestra and they don't need them on Carbon.
Yep.
Yeah, we didn't bring those today. We decided to make use of our people, but yeah.
Speaking of people, we have a special guest. Do you want to introduce?
Oh, yeah. We got Hannah Epperson in the house. Hannah, you want to come up and hang out?
Oh, yeah.
We got Hannah Epperson and a half.
Oh, it's more than a half.
It's more.
Let's be real.
This is the last legal week you can fly across Canada, I think.
Yeah, we're entering no-fly zone really soon here.
Okay, so if
that's
people are not
felony,
picking up on this, Hannah is pregnant.
It's very large. It's a whole thing.
How to introduce Hannah Epperson. Incredible songwriter, incredible singer, incredible person, dear friend of mine. Hannah was involved in a lot of aspects of the score in the end, but Hannah came on to write and record our last song, and I say song because it is more song than cue, of the film. Niobe, do you want to talk a little bit about why you felt we wanted a more song-sounding song at the very end of the show?
Yeah, are we doing cathedrals before we're doing the last cue? Okay, so yeah, it's a question of what comes first. But yeah, I mean, working in science and nature documentary with what I would call, from my naive point of view, a song as opposed to a cue where someone sings words is pretty unconventional. And it's difficult to do because you have so much information coming at the viewer the whole time. Where is there room for someone to sing and all of that, right? It requires a real change in pace, change in storytelling style to give a platform for a song to be sung. But still in this film, there was a place for that, and that was at the very end. But I don't want to jump ahead because I think we want to preface that by talking about another cue that Hannah worked on, and then we'll come back to that question of why this film deserved a song after that. How about we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Hannah came on first for the song, but we wanted little Easter eggs and breadcrumbs of her throughout the rest of the film. It just didn't seem right to have her come in right at the end. So there's little vocal samples that are Hannah throughout, and one of the things I wanted her to come sing on is a cue that we'll demo shortly, but it was a cue about Fairy Creek, and for those who don't know, Fairy Creek is a large section of old growth that was set to be logged, and there was quite the protest, the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history, to preserve that old growth forest. And the fight for Fairy Creek was happening while we were recording. And we're going to play this cue eventually, not with orchestra, because it's more about Hannah's performance. But Hannah, do you want to tell the story of the recording of this cue, or not to put you on the spot?
We recorded the end track, but since I was there in the studio, John thought I would like to bring Hannah in for a couple more vocalizations. I think John and I have a kind of a rapport that extends much farther than just the studio. I think we are politically aligned and socially aligned on a lot of things. And John knew that I had been following, to the best of my then pregnant ability, the things that were happening in Fairy Creek, and there had just been it was the day of, right? The day of the recording?
Functionally, as Hannah was biking to the studio, there was a major, without explaining too much, there was just like a major horrible setback with the Fairy Creek situation that was pretty emotional for us. And Hannah got to the studio. I was like, hey, we're about to record this cue, and this horrible thing happened, and we both had a big cry. And then we stepped into the booth. And in film music, it's very easy. We got to be on schedule, and things are, inevitably things go wrong, and it's a very technical thing to do. But luckily, there was a little bit of room for humanity here, and I think it was really captured in Hannah's beautiful performance to a cue that ended up being entirely choral as a prelude to that. I'm going to jump in and say that, I was talking with the larger team in Australia about this the whole time, and, I guess my job was to deal directly with Jonathan, but there were other voices in the room, and you really had to fight. We really had to fight for the cue to be this, what we're going to hear, to be this very simple, ethereal, voice-driven cue, and the original temp music was much thicker and richer, this was one of the hills that I died on for you, Jonathan, and I think it was a good hill to die on. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Thanks for being here since you're dead. That's quite a feat, I have to say.
Yeah, 9 lives. That's the director.
It was very important to me that a cue about such a sacred place be choral only. That felt right. And I don't know. Also, I just wanted to let Suzanne Simard speak a lot because she's amazing. But there is also this moment of, there's this before and after footage. We'll play it. You'll see. Should we?
Just before you do, I'd love to ask Hannah a question, actually, because Hannah and I were talking before this all started about a number of different things. And one thing that I never got to ask you backstage, and I'm glad I'm getting a chance now, is this idea of, like, you know, you're looking at this, you've come full circle, you were pregnant when you recorded this song with your first child, and now you're pregnant and you're here again with us, thank you very much. And you're looking at some of these pieces and sort of recalling these very emotional states and these things that are not just, this isn't a job for you, you're not just showing up and singing some notes and then going away with a paycheck. These issues matter to you, you care very deeply about that. And I guess my interest in this is how you sort of like bridge that, that sort of divide between being a human and having these emotional reactions and being very charged, and then being able to do a job, which is to sing these things and be coherent, I think, and to deliver something that people will respond to as opposed to just a burbling mess in front of the mic. How do you do that as a professional?
I mean, I think there's a reason I'm not the head of a department because the line between the kind of emotional, psychic stuff that animates music is very ambiguous. The line that separates that from life and my technique is very ambiguous and very fluid. And I think, to John's credit, he knows that about me, and I don't want to say he manipulated the situation, but I think John found an opportunity to connect on an issue that is like deeply human. There was this, we were shooting this, we were doing the cue for this scene about these just heartbreaking clear cuts, and the footage is like, I mean, it's so sinister. And with this, the news of the injunction, that morning that had been passed in Fairy Creek, I think it was just like, we could really dig into the more raw emotional side of this. And I think that's what we're trying to do when we make documentaries like this about stuff that's poignant and prevalent. And so I think there was like, again, don't think it was manipulative, but I think John saw a great opportunity for us to have a really human moment that could get translated into the score, you know, the score that felt right for this footage. But yeah, as a professional, that line that separates the humanity and the technique is not, there isn't one for me.
All right. Should we play it back?
Yeah, we can play it back. We can also talk. So we're going to try to give Hannah as much time to get to the live room as possible to sing the final cue. She's very speedy, but we're still going to do that. And it is interesting. I will say just a little bit about the last cue, not the cue that you're about to see, but Hannah was also pregnant at the time of writing the lyrics for that, which we could talk about now. We could talk about after we hear this cue.
I'm following your lead, head of department, man.
Oh, I think
we all look to the
I think
director.
Hannah can get out there to her position in under 5 minutes. So yeah, I think we can talk after this cue.
Okay,
yeah,
excellent.
I have faith.
Let's play it back. Well, we can play this whole thing too. I was going to just play a snippet. We could play the whole thing.
So she loves, you know, sequestering herself in these huge cathedrals, really, these huge cathedrals of carbon with all of her friends and cousins and relatives. If you imagine yourself as Miss Carbon, you would be being photosynthesized, you know, you'd be drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere and fixed through photosynthesis in these beautiful crowns, and then moved down into the roots and stored in these very stable compounds in the soil. And this cycle happens, you know, every day. It's just this huge drawdown of CO2. Fly over that beautiful canopy and suddenly they've just cut a clear cut. And every time we cut them down, carbon is released. She ends up back in the atmosphere. What we found is that immediately after harvesting, that about 60% of the carbon in that forest is gone, just like that. So what are we doing? I mean, these old growth forests that store some of the biggest carbon pools in the world, and those are the ones that we're cutting. The carbon cycle shows that we're all irretrievably connected. We're all in this together. That we are intimately part of the cycle too. We're made of carbon. What we do affects that carbon cycle, and that carbon cycle is affecting the livability of our planet.
I find myself bereft, in the air, looking for places to hide.
The number one thing we need to do with carbon is leave her in the...
Joe, we're good to go back.
Yeah, so I'll just say a little bit about the cinematography there. I think many people in Canada, at least, are familiar with these images that have appeared in the media of old-growth trees that are standing, and then the same tree shot from the same position after being cut. And you saw a series of 3 kind of elapsed times there with that effect. Those are taken by a West Coast conservationist called TJ Watt, and we worked with him. And he filmed the drone footage of that cut, which is in the Kekus Valley. And so yeah, and this is a very, it's a touching and sad and very important sequence in the film. I don't want the audience to who haven't seen the film to come away with the impression that we're so down the whole time. This is also a celebration of carbon in all of her glory. But yeah, this is a pretty heavy sequence, and the music really did elevate the importance, I think, of this piece. This is really a Canadian story within an international story. That's Suzanne Simard, the Canadian forest ecologist, who is really a bit at the forefront of discovering that trees speak to each other within a forest ecosystem, and she's finally getting her due. And that's her up on the screen, but really very fortunate to be able to work with those conservationists to bring you such impactful images.
Do we want to have Hannah move into position now, or do we have more questions for her?
Well, we could talk a little bit about the songwriting process for the song you're about to hear, maybe, because it was another cool act of serendipity that the final footage is a birth. It's a real birth on screen. I said once to Niobe, I was like, that fake baby looks really good. And then I was informed that that's what human birth looks like. It was a big learning experience. But Hannah was pregnant with her first baby at the time of us writing this cue, which I think probably had something to do with the inspiration. I'll also give you my mic because there might be some mic problems.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this was one of the easiest songs to write ever, because John approached me with a request to write a song based on the life cycle of carbon, and it was set to this incredible birth sequence that you will see. Not all births look like that. Not all births look like that, I can assure you. And I think the content, the lyrical content was so easy to write because I was pregnant at the time. My partner and I had worked through years of solitary and then, together climate grief and fear about bringing children into a world that has a lot of climate catastrophes coming down the chute. And I kind of felt like this was such fertile space to write music in. And it was the first time that you guys had actually set this whole sequence to another song. And it was the first time that I was asked to replace a song that was already there, which was maybe the hardest part of it. There's a beautiful, I don't actually remember the the woman's name. There's a beautiful song that was already, that they'd kind of edited that last scene to, and I needed to replace it and keep people happy. Though that was a curious part of it, but the content was, I think, again, John was like, I recognize that there's a person who might be able to speak to this really well right now. So I wrote this piece with violin. I think there was a little bit of violin, but guitar and vocals.
Yeah, and I'll add that we'd gotten to the end of 90 minutes of documentary about carbon. So we'd been everywhere. We'd been to the depths of despair in industrial warfare, to the Big Bang, to photosynthesis, organic chemistry. We've been to Mongolia and Tasmania and the rest of it. And the conundrum that we had, Daniela and I had, was how do you end this film? Like where do you go now, right?
Yeah.
You got your powder's wet. And we thought, well, this whole film is about how everything is moving in a cycle in our world.
Yeah.
Carbon's journeys show us that everything is cyclical. I mean, when we talk about dust to dust, it's the carbon is returning to that cycle of life that is eternal. And so what better a way to symbolize that those cyclical pathways of carbon than to show the beginning of a life, right?
Yeah.
And so it was an inspired idea. It was Daniela's idea to end with the birth of a baby. And when we see this, you should know that is a baby being born. And our cameraman, he got the call several hours into the labor. And so we'd worked this out months in advance, and the family was super keen. Oh yeah, we really want to have a professional cinematographer at the birth. That's great. But then water broke, and they totally forgot about that part. And then at some point,
Shocking.
how could they forget? And so they did call the cameraman, and it was in Sydney, Australia, and he had to drive across this huge city at high speed. So every frame that he shot made the cut. Because he was hitting record on his camera as he ran across the lawn.
Wow.
That's amazing.
I didn't know that.
There you go. Now
That's
you know.
amazing.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
so cool.
Well, do we want to send Hannah on her way into the hot seat?
Thank you, Hannah.
Been a pleasure. Been a place.
And while Hannah's getting herself settled and warmed up and the orchestra's getting itself ready, I'll ask you quickly, Jonathan, was there ever a plan B for anything? Did you have something in the back pocket in case certain things didn't work out?
Real estate is the plan B. It's such. I mean, it is a team sport. It's Adrian, you and I have talked about Formula One. It's not just the driver; it's the mechanics, it's the team. And it really isn't just the composer. There are orchestrators. We have Torsten Granresenhaus, who is like a godsend of a man. He's the project manager for me, and for this, he put together this whole thing basically today, and it's pretty easy to feel comforted when you know you have a whole team behind you. So yeah, I write the music. That's such a small part of a film composition that if something goes wrong, there's so many of us working to make it right. Both inside the composition, the music department, and outside.
That's perfect. End it there.
Okay, good. Done. Short and sweet. Should we play the cue? This is the final cue of the film.
Article is born, once it's released into the universe, she's going to live basically forever.
Maybe when you go out and look up at the night sky and just imagine planets with life on it, given all that carbon has going for it, that life is probably carbon-based. And so rather than think to yourself, gee, I'm not unique, no, say to yourself, gee, I'm a participant in a great unfolding story in the universe. A nuclear story, a chemical story, a biological story, where I have kinship across the cosmos. Because wherever I find life, it's going to have some carbon chemistry, just the way I do. Why not use that fact not to feel small, but instead to feel large and feel cosmically connected as never before?
My journey will go on, with or without you. You are the writer of your story now.
Woven inside you, before and behind you, I make, I take, I build, I die in the shadows. Wade into the river, the current will guide you into a violet sky, a field of stars where we were born. I'll be there in the end, and the start of a story. Life begins again. Breathe in and breathe me out. I draw the circle. I'll be there in the end, and the start of your journey. Feel me in your palms, know me in the water. I'll be there in the end. Life begins again. I'll be there in the end. Feel me in your palms. Know me in the water. I draw the circle.
Beautiful. That was so lovely. Another round of applause for Hannah, the orchestra, our wonderful choir, our conductor Claudio. What a beautiful, beautiful performance.
Oh my God, bravo.
All right.
Wow.
That is what we have for you tonight, folks. We'll have a Q&A now. So I think are we going to have people come in from the outside, or are we going to maintain our position as is?
Yeah, anybody who's on the floor who has a question, please come into the control room and we can chat. And please actually do. And then anybody online who has a question, I'm reading you now. And if you want to type it into the chat, we can answer it. And while that happens, our beautiful orchestra will get on the road because we got a storm coming in.
I know you guys wanted to do your thanks as well. Do you want to do that now or at the end of the Q&A?
We can do it at the end. At the end.
Okay.
Yeah. Are there any questions at all? Because that might be the thing. There might not be. Let's do our thank yous. While we wait. Well, I want to thank you two, first of all, for Niobe. Thanks for your trust in setting up this live event. Oh my God.
Oh, you mean us?
Oh yeah, you two sitting at the table. Torsten, Hannah, Dennis. I have a whole list of people I want to thank, but yeah, this kind of event's pretty rare, and it took a lot of work from a lot of people. So thank you, everybody, and the Canada Council for sponsoring this. Oh my God.
Yeah, there's a reason why we have credits at the end of the film and why they take 5 minutes to run. You can never thank everyone, but really wonderful that the Screen Composers Guild of Canada immediately saw the value in lifting the hood on this score and talking about what it takes to make a score like this and trying to help us communicate useful things to composers and filmmakers. I really think that it's worthwhile once you've made a film to lift the hood in that way. And thank you for giving us that opportunity. Thank you for asking us intelligent questions. There's so much that we take for granted that other people know. So, I think you're doing a service to the community of filmmakers in Canada. Thank you for doing that, Adrian.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I also like to give a big shout out to Tanya Dedrick, our wonderful managing director at the Screen Composers Guild. She is wonderful in every respect and such a hard work, and really did a lot to help us put this event together and to get the word out. And our partners at the DGC and the Canadian Music Centre as well, of course.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to read a list at the end and really do it. But we do have some questions. We also, anybody who's in the house, there's a little reception after. We got some snacks. So sorry for the online people. You'll be getting Uber Eats.
Go to your fridge now.
Q&A. Hello.
Yeah, I think, is it using a microphone over here? Is that how we do it?
Here? You don't have to be on camera if you don't want to be also.
Is that microphone hot? Or you got to use yours?
We'll see. Somebody on the live stream said they had a hard time hearing us. So. Hey, what's up? I'm John.
Hi, thank you so much. This is very interesting and entertaining. I'm a director and I'm curious. So when you have a spotting note, what do you tell the composer? How do you talk? What is that language about establishing the mood? If you can talk about that.
Don't mess it up.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah. I just tell Jonathan, don't mess it up. Here's a film. Make me music. No, that's not what happens.
Well, first of all, what are spotting notes?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. Thanks for asking it. I think this is a good question for all the directors, and I think you're a director. So when you lock picture, which means you've finished the editing process to the extent that pictures no longer change, that's when you can start working with your composer in earnest. And I always sit down at that point, usually for 3 or 4 days with my composer, and we go through the scene in detail, and we talk about the emotional grammar of the film. So, you've got highs and lows and midpoints, and, you want to reflect that emotional grammar with music and tone, but also the cognitive grammar. So when are we learning key things? When is there a pivot in our understanding? When is there a realization? When is there, a sense of anticipation and curiosity? And, I have found as a director that, nothing against the composers in the room, but sometimes the director needs to really explain that and point out those intellectual turning points, that part of the grammar. Darren Fung, who I started doing this with ages ago, said he always wanted to know who owned the scene. Now, whose scene is this? There's all these people up there, but whose is it? Because he needs someone to kind of attach his emotional post-it note to, right? My spotty notes for a film this long are typically like 10 pages plus, right? Of written notes, and then we go through it orally together. And the last thing to say about that is it's a collaboration. So we exchange ideas. To some extent, we talk about instrumentation. That's really the composer's turf, but you can talk about that as well. That means choice of instruments, all you directors out there. It's a critical part of the process. Absolutely.
Might be worth just mentioning the role of temp music and or using references.
Yeah.
To help communicate. That can be helpful sometimes, especially if you have your composer put together a playlist for you of different examples of what they might hear, and then you can do it's yourself. It's much easier to talk about, for yourself as a director, talk about narrative concerns or like characterization or emotional, like what you're trying to get across, as opposed to trying to talk music. And then if you need to talk music, then with the example, like I like this part right here, something's going on, and then your composer goes, oh, this part here or that part there. That's a nice shorthand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just very quickly to the point of talking music versus not. Niobe and I were just talking about this for another film, but your job as a film composer is kind of as a translator. So if you hire if you hire Claudio as an Italian translator, I'm not going to speak to him in Italian, in bad Italian. I'm going to speak to him in English and hope that he translates it into Italian. And so the idea is a little bit, if Niobe speaks to me in music, he might be misunderstanding certain things, or we might come from different musical places. But if he speaks to me in film and I'm bilingual, then I can translate sort of the intentions of the film language that he's speaking into music. And that is often more helpful than a director speaking in musical terms. Although Niobe is very good at speaking in musical terms, so yeah.
Follow-up question.
Yeah.
So since you brought up the temp music, what is your relationship with the temp music? Because to me personally, I see it and you inevitably fall in love because it's the first time you see your film to music. So how do you deal with this?
Turn it off.
Yeah, well, sometimes if you're honest, you fall so much in love with your temp music that you apologize to the conductor and you license the temp music. I mean, that is a thing that happens, right? But it's not the intention. No. I think that temp music is a really important communication tool, as Adrian says, with your composer. And sometimes I've made the mistake of choosing temp music that is just impossible to, not duplicate, but capture the spirit of, because it's Hans Zimmer and 5 orchestras and a pipe organ. Right, sorry about that. All those Hans Zimmer temps I've given you over the years.
You're only sorry if you don't do it again, and I know you will. So.
Yeah. But I mean, you just have to let it go. And so Hannah was talking about that when she was at the mic. She was talking about having to replace a song from a really wonderful jazz singer-songwriter from Australia, and it was a great cue, and my colleagues in Australia really just thought, it's so good, let's just license that. And Jonathan and I really argued that if we can work with someone here who has a personal relationship with this film, and also who sings words that we write, then it'll be even better. But that was a really difficult conversation, wasn't it? So what you're pointing out, that temp love thing, it's real.
It's called the mirror exposure effect in psychology, and it's the reason why you're more likely to marry somebody 1 door down than 4 doors down from you. It's just, and advertisers know this. The more you see something, the more you like it, and directors are the victim of their own brain, so you can't be so mad at them. Daniela, the other director, Ortega, on the chat has hopped on the chat. Hello, Daniela. She says, which I think is relevant right now. For Jonathan, what was it like working with such diverse temp music that we threw into the edit? And I'm not a great chameleon composer, I don't think. So for me, I basically tried to, because there was so much genre switching in this film, I basically tried to go as deep into writing from that genre's voice as I could, knowing that I couldn't go as far as better chameleons, and that there would be because of that, there would be an automatic tie between all the cues. I don't think I could physically write cues that wouldn't feel cohesive because I'm not that adaptable. And so it kind of gelled together. Ooh,
yeah, and Daniela, our co-director in Australia, she was the one in the edit suite choosing the temp music. It wasn't me. I just had to deal with the consequences of those choices. But
they were great.
Daniela made wonderful choices.
Yeah.
But she did choose like a straight ahead house techno tune for photosynthesis going inside the leaf, and then there was a Cuban salsa piece, right?
Yeah.
And so we hired a Cuban salsa band in Vancouver, but we never really achieved that.
No.
And we did in the end license that piece, but then your crazy friend from Norway, Sivert, who writes for the Eurovision Song Contest, gave us the techno.
Yeah. He's representing Denmark this year, even though he's Norwegian in the song contest.
Go
Everybody
Denmark.
Vote for Denmark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Niobe, let me ask you this then. When you're in the editing suite, like for me, I feel like temp music is temp music because it's temporary, which means you use it in order to communicate to a test audience. You use it to see if your film is actually working like a film because it needs that music to support it. But then you go, okay, it's good, then turn it off and continue to watch the film without the music. Is that possible? Like, does that make sense for, because that's what I feel like I want the answer to be, is like, yes, use temp music, it's necessary, but try to live with your film as much without it.
Oh God, that's
so that
awful.
Is this too unbearable? That's what it is it?
Yeah. Like that's looking at my face first thing in the morning in the bathroom mirror. Like I never want to see our edit without some kind of music on it. That's a scary experience. No, because we cut. You can talk with our editors right now. We edit from day one with music. The music is integrated into those cutting decisions and the mood. And so the scenes that have music can never live without music. I don't know if I answered your question, but I've never watched our scenes without music. I've never turned the music off.
Okay. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got from a composer, mentor of mine, Donald Kwani, said, make sure that when you're in the process of writing, we have a tendency as composers, I think, when we're working to pictures, to write to pictures. You're sitting there, you're watching this, like, this is where we do this from here. He said, make sure that you spend time with your music away from the picture and compose away from picture, because the picture will make your music sound better than it is. And I was like, that's really good advice, because yes, music can make the scene work even if it's still weak, but the opposite is also true. So for all you composers out there, make sure you write away from picture, because you might be getting fooled.
Yeah, Daniela also she's active in the chat, which is so fun because she was the other half of this. And she's saying, which is a great point that we should bring up before we get to our next question, is that one thing we ran into, when you work in film, there's cultural differences. And she pointed out the fact that in Australia, it's very common to work with a composer at the start of the edit, before picture lock, and composing happens alongside the edit and is adapting to the edit. And in Canada, for documentary especially, I think, in my experience, it's a picture lock thing and then you start. And temp music was very helpful and necessary in bridging those worlds, I think. So if you do a co-pro, you might end up meeting some different film culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of, I think of Johan Johansson, rest in peace, and Denis Villeneuve. I mean, they kind of conceived their films together. Hans Zimmer and Christopher Nolan do this as well, right? Like they design sequences together. But I've always found it really difficult. And, I will point out, Daniela, that we did encourage Jonathan to start working with us from the beginning, and we encouraged him to give us music, and he did. And when you started to use it in the edit suite, I got this note from the Australian editor. He said, "I feel like someone's jabbing my eyes with needles." and
oh
then,
my God!
And then the follow up from the executive producer Sonia Pemberton in Australia was, "I think, Niobe, maybe you should be looking for a different composer." So I bring that up because it can be really unfair on the composer to bring them in before it's time. you know, because you need to communicate your intentions really clearly as a filmmaker to the composer, or again, they're swinging in the dark, right? And I think you were swinging in the dark, and you were generous in giving us music, but music from other parts of your life, which weren't suited to this film. So I think you know, to be clear, the director, if they want to bring the composer in earlier, really needs to communicate the intentions for the film. It's fine to sort of, you know, play with some themes, but I just think it's very difficult for a conductor to get involved so early. What do you think, Jonathan?
I don't. I just compose. I don't think. No. It just really depends on the film. There's no such thing as a standard deal, and you know, as much as we'd like to standardize the process of making a film because it's more efficient and that means less stressful, it is the case that some films you need to start really early and some films you need to start really late, and you got to figure out what's right for your film. You know, every child is different, I guess. Yeah.
I'm just trying to say, directors, be nice to your composers.
You were all nice. Everyone was nice.
Yeah, I was filtering.
Oh.
That was filtering, the eyes jabbing? Oh yeah, come on.
Oh, now you're hearing it.
Hello.
Hello. Hi there.
Hey, thank you for allowing questions. This is very interesting. Thank you for organizing all of this. So I wanted to ask both of you, like, in this communication, this conceptual communication of something that you're creating that's very pertinent, right? Like nothing more essential than carbon, right? As carbon-based lives. So I wanted to ask, so how deep is that conceptual connection between you two in terms of like the theme development and orchestration? You know, you worked for with sounds, John, right? You worked for searching for sounds. Like, were you fishing for something like that was inherent carbon, right? Like, are you trying to do that, or like were you thinking, you know, like when it's orchestra, I'm going to have a choir because like the human component and like our responsibility with carbon. I mean, I haven't seen the film, but like I can see so much intentionality in this that, you know, like I'm just wondering how much of that conceptual like digging was created between you two, since like there was pages and pages of of all that, right?
You want me?
Go ahead, you start. Yeah.
I a lot to start and less as it goes on. I really like to work in a really conceptual way. I have a few other lives outside of film composing. One of them is as a field recordist, and I like to find sounds in places and figure them out. But there's a sliding scale of when that's appropriate, and it's usually at the beginning to try to, at least for me, try to figure out what the smell of the film is a little bit, you know? And depending on the piece too, you know, like documentary is not supposed to be entirely conceptual. So for Carbon, there was a lot of that at the beginning and way less of that as it went on. And compared to something like how I would treat narrative fiction or something, it was also less appropriate to go full concept mode.
Right.
There were times where it just had to sound like our version of film music, and it was important that it got out of the way aesthetically for what was on screen. I really like that about documentary. You're so much in service of what's on screen, and yeah, sometimes it just wasn't appropriate to be that conceptual, and sometimes it was, and that was a throttle that I got to play with.
Yeah, I mean, I have tons of respect for taking that kind of conceptual approach, and to make it concrete, we'll point to the tuned pieces of carbon that you got from Japan. I mean, early in the process, there was this idea that we could really harvest the sounds that we got by playing pure carbon. My point of view on that was, well, that's a good story. That's a good behind the scenes, and we can talk about it now, and that makes everyone feel good. But in the film itself, will that aid the story? And my feeling was no. unless it's the right sound for the cue we're making. But there's just really no room for those kinds of conceptual games in a process like we were engaged in, unless you're planning to tell a story about them afterwards. Like, it's kind of meta, you know? And so really, you know, when you sit down to make the music, it doesn't really matter what the instrument is, as long as it's creating the right emotion and following the grammar of the film itself, right? And we very quickly got there. And I'm really delighted that there is this Easter egg of the tuned carbon in the film, which we can point to now after the fact and say, that's pure carbon. But, you know, it could have been a, I don't know, hammer dulcimer, it could have been like tubular bells, as long as it was making the right sound for the moment, right?
I think yes, and in carbon especially, yes. I think it's a little bit of a Terrence Malick effect, where you're like, well, they didn't have to use the extinct language and teach all the extras that language, and they didn't have to use the exact right species of grass. But there's sort of this subconscious accumulation effect. And I think that happens in music sometimes. I think that is less of a thing in a film like this, but definitely a thing in film. I don't know. I still believe in a little bit in the subconscious power of finding these right ingredients, but there are some films where that's more important and less important. And for this one, the orchestra was the most important thing, for sure. Yeah. Cool. Do we have another one? Thank you. That's awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming. Thank you. We got one more. Or anybody online, too. And then we're going to eat food.
Nice. Yeah, I was going to ask, what is the food? I just kidding.
When is the food?
No, it's actually like a two-part question, like two questions that are related. My first question would be, how much time did you have when they delivered log picture until like you had the recording? And related to that, if you could elaborate on you were talking about orchestrators. I saw you had like a music assistant on the credits. If you could elaborate about like the whole team, like what kind of team does a film this size need?
Ooh, how long did we have between lock? It was a little weird because of COVID.
Yeah, we had 2.5 months, which was pretty generous for 90 minutes of film and probably about 85 minutes of film, about 78 minutes of music. Is that right?
No, I was wondering if there was more music than film because of overlapping cues. I think we hit basically there was basically as much music as there was picture.
Sorry.
So no, which is cool. I mean, and 2.5 months is a pretty good amount of time for that, for sure. As far as the team, and we knew this was going to be quick feeling, and we'd have to be adaptable because of COVID. So that was part of the reason we were writing themes ahead of time. Team, it's a pretty big team sport. Torsten over here was the assistant, which today I was like I think we should just say project manager. Assistant is such a weird term. But then probably 3 or 4 other people who were helping out with random little tasks, like prepping. There was almost 50 cues. So prepping that many cues for the orchestrators was a huge task. It was not a one-person task. So we had 3 or 4 people at a time doing that. There was 3 or 4 orchestrators. There was a contractor who figured out the orchestra. There was all the orchestra members. There was our mix engineer. I'm forgetting whoever else. It was a behemoth.
The whole recording team?
The whole recording. I mean, yeah, people like today, we have so many engineers and assistant engineers running around, and that was true then. I made it a full credits list, and we couldn't even put it in the theatrical version of the film, and we just had to say like the Vancouver Film Choir kind of thing. is huge. It's huge.
Yeah, and I mean, it's good to get practical questions like this. This is really useful information, I think, for the people listening. Typically, in a film of this scale, what happens is the composer will run, or their manager will run a subsidiary unit within the film. And so the way I like to do it, because I just don't understand the intricacies of creating the music in the way that Jonathan described, we basically give them a budget to manage, and they manage that budget, and they contract those people. The film is paying those people directly, but it's almost like you have to run that whole unit of the film yourself. You can't expect the producer to know who needs to be hired and what the rate should be. So yeah, I guess one of the jobs that you develop as a conductor is to understand how to build a budget, manage a budget, who you need, what they cost, how many hours. It is a bit of Excel spreadsheeting.
A person has to know this as a composer, but a person absolutely cannot do this and compose. Yeah. It's impossible to do it in time. And that's why somebody like Torsten is invaluable. Because, figuring out just things you wouldn't even think of.
Yeah, and just for the record, Torsten is booked for the next 8 months.
Yeah, no one can hire him. He's ours. But also, like,
Find your own Torsten.
Yeah, there aren't any. There's just one. It's a big old team sport. It's like being a football manager, for sure. They should make. You know how Football Manager is? Does anybody know Football Manager, like the game?
No.
It's like it's a game where you. Anyways, you should make one for being a film composer.
Okay.
The SCGC is on it. They're gonna do it. Speaking of, as we wrap up, and thank you so much, I'm straight up gonna do it. I wrote down, because there's so many names. Niobe, Adrian, Tanya, thank you all so much. James Clement Seeley, our engineer, for Carbon, who set up the session, for the wonderful Dennis Patterson, who is running this today. Hannah, Revolution, Paperbag, DGC, CMC, CFC, all the crew here, cannot thank you enough. Claudio, Lenny, Torsten, thank you all. And Vadim, over there running the video, there he is. It's an enormous task, and an incredible task to do a live stream like this, and we are spoiled rotten by him, so thank you. And
finally, thank you to all of our wonderful partners in Australia at Gene Pool Productions, and my co-director Daniela, my co-producer Sonia Pemberton, and thank you, Jonathan Kawchuk, for such a wonderful score. Ultimately, we wouldn't be sitting here tonight celebrating the score if it was anything less than spectacular. So, good job.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for joining us all.
Bye.